Paris, 1940. The apartment had already been abandoned. Heavy curtains were still drawn against the summer light. Dust floated in the silence. The city outside was occupied, but inside this private residence, time seemed suspended, as if its owners believed they would return in a few days. They never did. German officers entered not like soldiers, but like curators. They wore gloves. They carried folders. One of them unfolded a typed inventory list. Another walked directly toward a framed painting hanging above a marble fireplace. He did not hesitate. The painting was carefully lifted from the wall. It was not random. It was not opportunistic. It was not war chaos. It was pre-selected. The artwork was The Astronomer, painted by Johannes Vermeer in 1668. A quiet scene of a scholar bent over his instruments, measuring the universe with calm precision. A painting about knowledge. A painting about order. A painting destined for a future empire. This was not looting in the traditional sense. There was no smashing of glass, no frantic grabbing, no drunken theft. This was bureaucracy. The operation was directed by Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the specialized Nazi task force created to seize cultural property across occupied Europe. Its founder, Alfred Rosenberg, believed that culture itself was a battlefield. Art was not decoration. Art was proof. Proof of racial superiority. Proof of historical destiny. Proof that civilization had always belonged to those who now claimed it by force. For Adolf Hitler, this mission was personal. Before he became a dictator, he had tried to become an artist. Twice, he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Twice, he was rejected. History remembers the war. Few remember the portfolio. That humiliation never disappeared. It transformed. By the late 1930s, Hitler was no longer trying to enter the art world. He was preparing to own it. He envisioned a grand cultural monument in his hometown of Linz, the Führermuseum, a museum that would eclipse the Louvre, the Vatican, and every major European collection. It would gather the greatest masterpieces ever created and present them as the natural inheritance of the Third Reich. And so lists were drawn, dealers were pressured, collectors were identified, Jewish families were targeted first. The war provided the cover. Ideology provided the justification. In Paris alone, thousands of works were seized from private collections, especially from prominent Jewish families, such as the Rothschilds. Entire rooms were emptied. Paintings were wrapped, catalogued, transported to warehouses. Each piece was photographed, measured, assigned a number. Culture had become inventory. The Nazis did not merely steal paintings. They mapped them. They sorted them into categories: for Hitler, for Hermann Göring, for state museums, for sale abroad in exchange for foreign currency. Even modern art they publicly condemned as degenerate was quietly sold in Switzerland to finance the regime. Hypocrisy was not a flaw. It was strategy. Back in that silent Paris apartment, the wall where Vermeer once hung was now empty. A pale rectangle remained, cleaner than the rest of the wallpaper. A ghost of ownership. The painting would travel across borders under armed protection. It would be stored, hidden, and eventually discovered again in the collapsing ruins of a defeated empire. But in 1940, none of that was visible. What was visible was something far more dangerous. A regime that understood that power was not only about land or armies. It was about narrative. Who defines beauty? Who defines heritage? Who decides which civilization survives? The Third Reich did not want to destroy European culture. It wanted to curate it, and in doing so, rewrite history itself. They weren't stealing art. They were attempting to steal civilization. And the war over stolen beauty would outlive the Reich itself. Hitler's Museum of Destiny. Long before the war, before the speeches, before the armies crossed borders, there was a young man standing in front of a drawing board in Vienna. He believed he was meant to be an artist. In 1907, and again in 1908. Adolf Hitler applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. He was rejected both times. The examiners noted that his architectural sketches showed some promise. But his human figures were weak, lifeless, technically flawed. He was advised to pursue architecture instead. He never forgot that advice. He never forgave that rejection. Historians often treat this episode as a psychological footnote. But for Hitler, art was not a hobby. It was validation. It was identity. And when he failed to enter the art world through merit, he later entered it through power. By the 1930s, as Chancellor and then Führer of Germany, Hitler no longer needed acceptance from professors. He had something far greater, the authority to define culture itself. He saw art not as expression, but as hierarchy. Classical realism represented order, discipline, racial purity. Modernism represented decay, corruption, and what he called cultural Bolshevism. This belief would shape not only German museums, but the fate of Europe's greatest collections. In 1937, the regime staged two simultaneous exhibitions in Munich. One was the Great German Art Exhibition, celebrating idealized Aryan bodies, rural landscapes, and heroic myth. The other was degenerate art, a public humiliation of modern masters whose works were displayed chaotically, mocked with sarcastic captions, and framed as evidence of moral collapse. The message was clear. The Third Reich would decide what beauty meant. And once the war began, that authority would expand beyond Germany's borders. Hitler's ultimate vision was not Berlin. It was Linz. His modest Austrian hometown would become the cultural capital of the New World Order. The project was called the Führermuseum, a monumental complex designed to house the greatest masterpieces in human history. Architectural plans were drafted. Models were built. The museum would stretch along the Danube, dwarfing the Louvre in scale. But a museum requires collections. And Hitler had already begun building his. Unlike many dictators who collect art impulsively, Hitler approached acquisitions with obsessive detail. He reviewed catalogs personally. He approved specific paintings. He compared works. Agents were dispatched across Europe to identify masterpieces suitable for Linz. Some were purchased under pressure. Others were confiscated outright once Germany occupied new territories. After the annexation of Austria in 1938, Jewish-owned collections were among the first to be targeted. Wealthy families were forced to sell under duress or had their assets seized entirely. What began as legal transfer quickly turned into systematic plunder. Among Hitler's desired works were old masters: Vermeer, Rembrandt, Titian, Rubens. He did not want modern experimentation. He wanted permanence. To him, Renaissance and Baroque masters represented an unbroken European lineage that the Third Reich would now claim as its heir. In his mind, this was not theft. It was reclamation. He believed that great art belonged to those capable of ruling history. And history, he was certain, now belonged to Germany. But Hitler was not the only collector in the regime. Hermann Göring built his own massive private collection, often competing directly with Hitler's agents. While Hitler favored austere classical works, Göring's taste was more eclectic and more opportunistic. Paintings confiscated from Jewish families were sometimes diverted before reaching official repositories. Rivalries within the Nazi elite turned looting into internal competition. Art had become currency, not only financially, but politically. The most chilling aspect of the project was its normalization. Special commissions evaluated works with bureaucratic calm. Legal decrees redefined ownership. Museums across occupied Europe were inspected under the pretext of preservation. The machinery of cultural conquest operated with spreadsheets and stamps. There were no smashed frames in these transactions. There were signatures. By 1940, as German forces swept through Western Europe, the scale expanded exponentially. France alone held some of the most prestigious private collections in the world. Many were owned by Jewish families who fled as the Wehrmacht advanced. Their absence made seizure easier. Apartments were sealed. Inventories were drafted. Entire libraries and galleries were emptied within days. The regime justified it as protective custody of European heritage. In reality, it was extraction. The Führermuseum was never completed, but by the height of the war, its planned collection already numbered in the thousands. Each painting was a brick in a future empire of narrative control. Because this was never just about aesthetics, it was about legitimacy. If the Third Reich could gather the masterpieces of Europe under one roof, it would symbolically crown itself as the natural culmination of Western civilization. The message would be unmistakable. The past leads to us. And in 1940, as trains loaded with crates rolled eastward, it seemed, at least to those orchestrating it, that history itself was being packed and redirected. The war for territory had begun, but a quieter war had already been underway for years. A war over memory. A war over ownership. A war over who has the right to display civilization and call it their own. And soon, that war would become fully industrialized. The machinery of plunder. By the time German troops entered Paris in June 1940, the system was already prepared. This was not improvisation, it was logistics. At the center of the operation stood Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, known simply as the ERR. Created under the authority of Alfred Rosenberg, the unit's mission was clear: identify, confiscate, catalog, and redistribute cultural property across occupied Europe. They did not call it theft. They called it securing cultural assets. The ERR established headquarters in the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris. Once a gallery space, it became a sorting center for Europe's stolen heritage. Paintings arrived in trucks. Crates were opened. Specialists, art historians, archivists, curators, examined each work. They took notes. They compared signatures. They assessed condition. Every painting was photographed and assigned a number. The Nazis created one of the most meticulous art inventories in history. The irony is brutal. The same regime that destroyed cities preserved detailed documentation of every stolen canvas. Among the primary targets were Jewish collectors, especially prominent banking families like the Rothschilds. Entire private galleries vanished. In Paris alone, tens of thousands of artworks were confiscated from Jewish-owned collections. Not looted in chaos, removed in sequence. Living rooms were emptied. Frames were lifted carefully. Packing materials were professional. The owners were gone, deported, in hiding or fleeing. Their absence made the operation efficient. The ERR did not act alone. Local collaborators provided information. Bank records revealed ownership. Tax archives listed estates. Seizures were often legalized through racial laws that stripped Jewish citizens of property rights. The legal framework turned theft into policy. If ownership could be redefined, confiscation became administrative. This is how genocide and bureaucracy intersected, not only in camps, but in culture. Inside the Jeu de Paume, hierarchy governed every decision. Some works were marked Sonderauftrag Linz, reserved for Hitler's future Führermuseum. Others were set aside for high-ranking officials. And then, there were works labeled for sale. Despite public campaigns against degenerate art, the regime quietly sold modernist paintings abroad, especially in Switzerland, to obtain foreign currency. The contradiction was deliberate. Ideology was a performance. Profit was pragmatic. The scale expanded as German occupation widened. In the Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, and later Italy, the same structure replicated itself. Special teams moved in after military control was secured. Museums were inspected. Private collections were seized. Monasteries and libraries were searched. The war created corridors. The ERR filled them with crates. Transport was coordinated through rail networks. Shipments traveled under military guard toward Germany and Austria. Some went to central repositories. Others were stored in castles, monasteries, and industrial buildings. Each location was chosen strategically, secure, isolated, defensible. Art was now cargo, and like any valuable cargo, it required insurance. The Nazis insured their theft with documentation. The inventory lists they created would later become crucial evidence, but in the moment, they were tools of control. One of the most revealing aspects of the machinery was specialization. Some experts evaluated authenticity, others determined political suitability, others calculated market value. This was not vandalism. It was curatorship under dictatorship. The regime treated art as both ideology and asset class. Paintings legitimized the Reich's claim to cultural supremacy. At the same time, they functioned as financial reserves. When bombs fell and fronts collapsed, art could be traded, sold, or hidden. Unlike currency, masterpieces retained value across borders. The Third Reich was building a shadow treasury. Competition within the Nazi elite intensified the process. Hermann Göring personally visited the Jeu de Paume multiple times, selecting works for his private collection. Witnesses described how he would browse the confiscated paintings like a shopper in a gallery, pointing at pieces he wanted. The line between state plunder and personal enrichment blurred completely. Hitler claimed destiny. Göring claimed taste. The victims had no claim at all. What makes this machinery chilling is not only its scale, but its professionalism. Art historians participated. Museum directors cooperated. Clerks processed files. Ordinary expertise became extraordinary complicity. The theft of Europe's cultural heritage was not carried out by mobs. It was carried out by administrators. By 1943, as the war began to turn against Germany, the ERR accelerated evacuations. Allied bombing threatened repositories in Berlin and other cities. Collections were moved deeper into the Reich, into mines, into tunnels, into mountains. The art empire was going underground. But underground storage would create a new chapter in this story, one that would unfold as the Third Reich collapsed. Because the same regime that cataloged beauty with precision was now preparing to hide it from the world, and some of it would almost disappear forever. Degenerate and profitable. In 1937, before Europe was in flames, the Third Reich staged one of the most revealing cultural spectacles in modern history. It was not a battle. It was an exhibition. Inside a gallery in Munich, paintings were hung crookedly, crammed together, framed with mocking slogans scrawled across the walls. Visitors were encouraged to laugh, to sneer, to feel superior. This was the exhibition of Entartete Kunst, degenerate art. The regime presented modernism as a disease. Abstract forms were described as symptoms. Distorted bodies were framed as moral corruption. Experimentation was called racial decay. More than 600 works were displayed, confiscated from German museums. The goal was humiliation. But humiliation was only the surface. Behind the propaganda, another operation was unfolding. The artists targeted were not obscure radicals. They were some of the most influential figures of the 20th century. Pablo Picasso, Marc Chagall, Wassily, Kandinsky, Paul Klee. Their works were labeled as evidence of cultural collapse. Visitors were told that such art could only emerge from racial impurity, mental illness, or Jewish influence. The exhibition drew more than 2 million visitors. It was wildly successful, but not in the way it appeared. Publicly, the regime condemned modern art. Privately, it monetized it. The same paintings that were mocked in Munich were quietly removed from Germany and sent abroad. Switzerland became a key marketplace. Dealers with connections to the regime arranged sales to collectors in neutral countries. The Third Reich needed foreign currency. Modern art, despised in speeches, became a financial instrument. The contradiction was not accidental. It was calculated. Ideology was theater. Economics was survival. Picasso presents one of the clearest examples of this hypocrisy. Living in Paris during the occupation, Picasso refused to leave the city. His works were banned in Germany, declared degenerate, and removed from collections. Yet Nazi officials still recognized their market value. Picasso's paintings were not destroyed en masse. They were traded. Some ended up in Swiss auctions. Others were seized from Jewish collectors and later sold through intermediaries. The regime that condemned his style as cultural poison relied on it to stabilize its finances. This was not inconsistency. It was opportunism. Marc Chagall's story reveals another layer. Born into a Jewish family in what is now Belarus, Chagall's art blended folklore, mysticism, and modernist techniques. To Nazi ideologues, his work symbolized everything they rejected: Jewish identity, emotional expression, rejection of classical form. His paintings were removed from German museums early in the Purge. Many were displayed in the Degenerate Art exhibition. But once the war expanded westward, Chagall's works became targets for confiscation from private collections. In France, Jewish collectors who owned Chagall's paintings saw their homes emptied. The art that represented cultural contamination was too valuable to ignore. The term degenerate itself carried scientific pretension. It borrowed from pseudo-medical language, suggesting infection and decay. The Nazis framed art as a biological indicator of national health. Healthy art depicted heroic bodies and rural landscapes. Degenerate art distorted reality. The classification mirrored racial theory. Just as the regime divided people into categories of purity and contamination, it divided culture the same way. Art became an extension of eugenics. But the policy was never entirely consistent. While thousands of modern works were confiscated from German institutions, not all were destroyed. Some were burned in public gestures. Others were stored. Others were sold. The regime carefully selected which pieces would serve propaganda and which would serve profit. In 1939, an auction in Lucerne, Switzerland, sold dozens of degenerate works removed from German museums. International buyers attended. The event was almost surreal. A regime denouncing modernism was funding itself through its liquidation. The public rhetoric and private behavior diverged completely. There is a deeper irony. By labeling modern art as degenerate, the Nazis unintentionally amplified its notoriety. Collectors outside Germany began to view banned works as symbols of resistance. The stigma became a badge of artistic authenticity. The attempt to suppress modernism helped globalize it. The regime wanted cultural purification. It helped accelerate cultural transformation. Inside occupied territories, the line between degenerate and desirable blurred further. When German forces entered France, the ERR cataloged thousands of modern works from Jewish collections. Some were designated unsuitable for German museums, but suitable for sale. Others were evaluated for their artistic merit, despite ideological condemnation. The bureaucracy of plunder overruled ideology when money was involved. The most revealing aspect of the degenerate art campaign is not that it targeted artists. It is that it exposed how culture can be weaponized. By declaring certain aesthetics unacceptable, the regime shaped public taste. It redefined what citizens were allowed to admire. Art was no longer personal. It was political. Museums became ideological classrooms. And yet, even within the Nazi leadership, aesthetic preference varied. Hitler preferred classical realism. He admired Renaissance masters. He despised abstraction. Hermann Göring, on the other hand, showed a more eclectic appetite. While publicly aligned with official doctrine, he privately acquired works that did not always conform to strict ideological criteria. Power complicated purity. Ambition complicated ideology. And greed complicated everything. The degenerate art exhibition also served another purpose: distraction. In 1937, Germany was preparing for expansion. Rearmament was accelerating. Political repression intensified. By focusing public attention on cultural corruption, the regime reinforced a narrative of internal cleansing before external conquest. Art became rehearsal. If society could accept that paintings were enemies of the state, it could accept that people were too. The logic was transferable. The concept of degeneration allowed the regime to merge aesthetics with race. Jewish artists were not simply creators of unpopular styles. They were framed as biological threats to civilization. The artistic purge prefigured the human purge. Culture was the laboratory. Europe would become the experiment. And yet, despite the spectacle, the regime never fully destroyed the art it condemned. Too much of it was useful. Too much of it was valuable. Too much of it could be converted into influence abroad. The Third Reich was willing to mock modernism in public, as long as it could monetize it in private. The hypocrisy reveals something crucial. The Nazi art empire was not purely ideological. It was transactional. By the early 1940s, as the war intensified and resources grew scarce, art increasingly functioned as a strategic reserve. Paintings could be sold discreetly. They could be exchanged for favors. They could be hidden. The regime's contempt for modernism never prevented it from exploiting it. And in this contradiction lies one of the central truths of the Nazi cultural project. It was never about purity alone. It was about control. Control over meaning. Control over narrative. Control over what the future would remember. While bombs fell over Europe, crates filled with masterpieces moved in the opposite direction, toward storage sites deep inside the Reich. The public exhibitions of degenerate art ended. The quiet relocation began. Because if modern art was dangerous, it was still too powerful to leave behind. And soon, some of these works would disappear into mountains, into salt mines carved from stone, where the fate of Europe's cultural memory would hang by explosives. The campaign against degenerate art revealed the regime's ideological mask. The next chapter would reveal its desperation. As the war turned, the art empire would go underground, and not everything hidden there was meant to survive. The treasure beneath the mountain. By 1943, the war was no longer unfolding according to German plans. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied bombers darkened the skies over German cities. Industrial centers burned. And somewhere far from the front lines, inside tunnels carved deep into alpine rock, Europe's greatest masterpieces were being lowered into the earth. The Nazi art empire was going underground. One of the most important storage sites lay in Austria, hidden inside the vast tunnels of the Altaussee salt mine. For centuries, salt had been extracted from its chambers. Now, those same chambers would hold something far more valuable than minerals. They would hold stolen civilization. Altaussee was ideal, remote, deep inside a mountain, naturally cool and stable in temperature, perfect for preserving paintings. Beginning in 1943, convoys transported crates into the mine under military supervision. The works came from across occupied Europe, from Paris, Amsterdam, Brussels, Vienna. Some were destined for Hitler's planned museum in Linz. Others were simply being hidden from Allied bombing. The mine became a vault. By 1945, thousands of artworks were stored there. Among them were paintings by Vermeer, Rembrandt, Michelangelo, and countless others. Each crate represented not only artistic genius, but stolen lives. The tunnels stretched for miles. Paintings were stacked along wooden supports. Sculptures were wrapped and secured. Detailed inventories were kept. Even as cities above ground turned to rubble, the regime continued to protect its art. It is a disturbing contrast. Human beings were being transported in cattle cars. Masterpieces were transported in padded crates. As the Third Reich began to collapse in early 1945, panic reached the leadership. What should be done with the hidden collections? Some officials wanted to preserve them at all costs. Others feared they would fall into Allied hands. And then came one of the most chilling orders of the war. Adolf Hitler's Nero Decree called for the destruction of infrastructure and assets that might benefit the enemy. The idea was simple. If Germany could not win, it would leave nothing behind. This logic extended to art. If the Reich could not possess Europe's cultural treasures, perhaps no one should. Inside Altaussee, explosives were delivered. Massive charges were placed in the tunnels. The plan was clear. Collapse the mine. Destroy everything inside. Thousands of paintings, sculptures, cultural memory spanning centuries, reduced to dust. Not collateral damage, intentional erasure. But here, history took an unexpected turn. Local miners understood what was at stake. They had worked in those tunnels for years. They knew the layout better than any officer, and they resisted. Accounts suggest that they sabotaged the demolition plan. Explosives were removed. Orders were delayed. Arguments were made that detonating the charges would permanently destroy the mine itself, a valuable industrial resource. In the chaos of the final weeks of the war, hesitation saved art. When American forces advanced into Austria in May 1945, they discovered the cache intact. Crates stacked in rows, paintings leaning against salt walls, an underground museum that had never opened to the public. The discovery shocked even hardened soldiers. They had expected weapons. They found civilization. The task of recovery fell to a specialized Allied group known as the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Program, later nicknamed the Monuments Men. Their mission was unprecedented: locate, secure, and return stolen cultural property. Altaussee became one of their most significant finds. Thousands of works were carefully removed from the mine and transported for identification. It was one of the greatest art recoveries in history. Among the works stored, there were paintings specifically selected for Hitler's Linz museum, masterpieces that would have symbolized the cultural legitimacy of a Nazi-dominated Europe. Instead, they became evidence. Evidence not only of theft, but of obsession. The Altaussee mine revealed the scale of the regime's ambition. This was not random looting. It was accumulation on an imperial scale. A museum that never existed had almost erased the museums of the past. The discovery also revealed something deeper. The Third Reich had prioritized art even in its final days. As military collapse accelerated, as cities fell, as supply lines failed, resources were still devoted to hiding paintings. Why? Because art represented continuity. The regime believed that even if it lost the war militarily, cultural control could extend its legacy. If the masterpieces of Europe bore the imprint of Nazi curation, future generations might interpret history differently. Control the narrative, control the memory, control the meaning of civilization. But Altaussee was only one of many repositories. Across Germany and Austria, Allied forces uncovered hidden caches in castles, monasteries, tunnels, and abandoned factories. Some collections had already been moved repeatedly to avoid bombing. Others had vanished entirely. Not every crate was found. Not every masterpiece returned. The art empire fractured as the regime disintegrated. There is a haunting image often described by witnesses: masterpieces leaning against raw stone walls, illuminated by lantern light, salt crystals glittering in the darkness. A Renaissance Madonna resting in a mine carved for industrial labor. Centuries of beauty hidden beneath a collapsing dictatorship. It is almost allegorical. Art survived. The Reich did not. Yet survival did not equal justice. Recovery was only the beginning. Returning works to rightful owners proved far more complicated. Many collectors were dead. Entire families had been exterminated. Documents were incomplete. Ownership had been obscured through forced sales and falsified records. The art emerged from the mountain. Its history did not. Altaussee stands as both triumph and warning. Triumph, because thousands of works were saved from deliberate destruction. Warning, because their presence there proves how close Europe came to cultural annihilation. The Nazi art empire was not only about acquisition, it was prepared to end in obliteration. If the Reich could not possess beauty, it would bury it. If it could not control civilization, it would attempt to silence it. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but the struggle over stolen art was only entering a new phase. Recovery would give way to restitution, and restitution would expose another uncomfortable truth. Even after the fall of the Third Reich, stolen beauty did not always find its way home. The art that never came home. When Allied forces uncovered the hidden repositories of stolen art in 1945, there was a sense of victory. The paintings had survived. Civilization, it seemed, had been rescued from the mountain. But rescue is not the same as return. The monuments officers cataloged thousands of recovered works and transferred them to central collecting points in Germany. From there, pieces were meant to be restituted to their countries of origin. Yet, a crucial question lingered. Return them to whom? Governments were still standing. Families often were not. Entire Jewish dynasties had vanished in the Holocaust. Collectors who once filled Parisian apartments with Renaissance masters and Impressionist canvases had been deported, murdered, or scattered across continents. Ownership records were incomplete. Many artworks had been sold under coercion before confiscation. Some had changed hands multiple times during the war. Legal clarity dissolved in moral ambiguity. Museums across Europe received returned artworks. National institutions reclaimed paintings seized by the Nazis. But private heirs faced a much more complicated road. For decades after the war, restitution moved slowly. In some cases, governments argued that works purchased legally, even under occupation, were now state property. Museums claimed good faith acquisition. The past became negotiable. One of the most powerful modern restitution cases centered on a single painting. Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I, painted by Gustav Klimt in 1907. The portrait depicted Adele Bloch-Bauer, a prominent Viennese Jewish patron of the arts. After the Anschluss in 1938, the Bloch-Bauer family was targeted. Their assets were seized. The Klimt painting was confiscated and eventually displayed in Austria's Belvedere Gallery. For decades, it hung there as a national treasure. Tourists admired it. Few questioned its path. But history resurfaced through one woman, Maria Altmann. Maria Altmann was Adele Bloch-Bauer's niece. After fleeing Austria during the Nazi era, she built a life in the United States. For years, she assumed that reclaiming her family's art was impossible. Austria had declared the Klimt a national icon. But in the 1990s, newly opened archives revealed the extent of Nazi confiscation and post-war obfuscation. Altmann decided to fight. The legal battle that followed was extraordinary. Austria argued that its courts should not be subject to a claim filed in the United States. Sovereign immunity laws protected foreign governments from certain lawsuits. Altmann's case eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2004, the court ruled that the lawsuit could proceed. It was a landmark decision. The past, even when protected by decades of silence, was not immune to challenge. After arbitration in Austria, the Klimt paintings were finally awarded to Maria Altmann in 2006, nearly 70 years after their confiscation. The portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I was later sold for a record-breaking sum. But more importantly, it was publicly acknowledged as stolen property. The painting's golden surface now carried visible history. It was no longer just art. It was testimony. The Altmann case triggered a broader wave of restitution claims across Europe and the United States. Museums began reviewing provenance records more seriously. Archives were digitized. Investigative journalists exposed questionable acquisitions. Some institutions cooperated. Others resisted. The debate intensified. Should museums retain artworks if they purchased them in good faith decades ago? Does the passage of time dilute injustice? If a painting has become part of national identity, does that identity outweigh the rights of descendants? The Nazi art empire had officially collapsed in 1945, but its shadows persisted in storage rooms and gallery walls. Even today, artworks occasionally surface with suspicious histories. In 2012, German authorities discovered hundreds of works hidden in a Munich apartment belonging to Cornelius Gerlit, the son of a Nazi-era art dealer. The find reignited global attention on unresolved restitution cases. The art market, discreet, international, often opaque, remains vulnerable to historical amnesia. Restitution is rarely simple. Documents are missing. Witnesses are gone. Values have skyrocketed. Some heirs seek financial compensation. Others seek acknowledgement. Some museums fear empty walls. Others fear reputational damage. The legal questions intertwine with moral ones. The tragedy of Nazi art theft was not limited to wartime destruction. It extended into peacetime hesitation. For decades, many governments preferred stability over confrontation. The Cold War shifted priorities. Economic recovery overshadowed cultural reckoning. The urgency faded. The paintings did not. They remained in frames, visible, admired, yet historically unsettled. There is an uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Some stolen works were returned. Many were not. Some were absorbed into state collections. Some were sold quietly through intermediaries. Some are likely still hanging in private homes, their provenance obscured by layers of transactions. Beauty survived. Justice did not always follow. The Nazi art empire was built on two pillars: ideology and acquisition. After 1945, those pillars crumbled, but the questions they raised endured. Who owns history? Can art ever be separated from the violence that displaced it? If a masterpiece hangs safely in a museum, does that safety compensate for its origin? The battle over stolen art is not only about property, it is about narrative. Acknowledging theft means acknowledging complicity, not only of the regime that stole, but of institutions that later benefited from silence. Returning a painting is an act of correction. Refusing to return it is an act of interpretation, and interpretation shapes memory. Today, visitors stand in front of Klimt's portrait, Vermeer's quiet interiors, or countless other masterpieces once targeted by Nazi confiscation. They see color, light, technique. What they often do not see is displacement. Behind many frames lies a story of forced sale, exile, confiscation, transport, concealment, litigation. Art history and human history are inseparable. The Third Reich lost the war. Its leaders were tried. Its cities rebuilt. But the empire it built in crates and catalogs continues to echo. Because every time a restitution claim is filed, every time a museum reevaluates a painting's past, the question returns: can stolen beauty ever fully belong to anyone again? The Nazis sought to curate civilization. They failed. But the struggle over who curates memory is still unfolding. The Nazis lost the war, but the battle over stolen beauty is not over. Who owns stolen beauty? The war ended in 1945. The Reich collapsed. Its leaders were dead, imprisoned, or disgraced. Its banners were torn down, but the paintings remained. And that is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because stolen art does not behave like stolen gold. Gold melts. Currencies collapse, borders shift, art survives, and survival complicates justice. A painting does not scream when it is taken. It does not resist. It does not carry visible scars of displacement. It hangs silently, even when its owners have been erased. That silence makes it dangerous. Because silence allows reinterpretation. A masterpiece displayed in a national museum can slowly detach from its violent origin. Visitors see brushstrokes, not confiscation. Lighting, not loss. Time softens theft, and institutions benefit from that softening. The Nazi art empire was never just about possession. It was about authority. authority over culture, authority over heritage, authority over memory. By assembling Europe's greatest works under one regime, the Third Reich aimed to rewrite legitimacy itself. If they owned the past, they could define the future. This is why the project mattered so deeply to Hitler. The Führermuseum was not a gallery. It was a declaration. Civilization belongs to us. When the regime fell, that declaration fractured, but it did not disappear. Because ownership of art has always implied ownership of narrative. Museums are not neutral spaces. They tell stories through arrangement, through curation, through context. A painting in Paris tells one story. The same painting in Linz would have told another. And the same painting in a post-war museum tells yet another. Location shapes meaning. Meaning shapes memory. Restitution debates expose this tension. When heirs demand the return of a painting, museums often argue that they protect and preserve culture for the public good. It is a powerful argument, but it carries an implicit assumption that preservation outweighs origin, that visibility outweighs justice, that the collective benefits more from possession than individuals benefit from return. These are not purely legal questions. They are moral ones. Consider this paradox. If a museum has displayed a stolen painting for 70 years, generations have grown up associating that work with national identity. The painting becomes woven into cultural self-understanding. Removing it feels like loss. But that feeling mirrors the original loss experienced by the family it was taken from. One absence replaces another. Justice is not symmetrical. The Nazi project forced Europe to confront a brutal truth. Culture is not immune to violence. It can be weaponized. It can be categorized. It can be traded. It can be buried. And it can be rewritten. The art empire of the Third Reich functioned as a rehearsal for something larger. If a regime can convince a population that certain forms of beauty are illegitimate, it can convince them that certain forms of life are too. Aesthetic exclusion becomes moral exclusion. Cultural purification becomes human purification. The logic scales easily. Even today, conflicts around the world demonstrate that art remains a strategic target. Museums are bombed. Libraries are burned. Statues are toppled. Cultural heritage sites are looted. Destroying culture destabilizes identity. Stealing culture transfers legitimacy. The Nazis understood this before many others. They did not simply destroy what they hated. They curated what they wanted to inherit. But here is the deeper question. Can stolen beauty ever be fully restored? When a painting is returned to heirs decades later, something has already changed. The original owners are gone. The context is altered. The art has traveled through hands, institutions, narratives. Return is correction, but not reversal. History leaves residue. There is also the issue of transformation. Some stolen works, once returned, are sold at auction for enormous sums. Critics argue this commodifies memory. Supporters argue it restores agency. Who has the right to decide? The descendant who inherits trauma? The institution that safeguards the object? The state that claims historical continuity? Ownership becomes layered. Legal title does not erase moral complexity. The Nazi art empire failed in its ultimate ambition. The Führermuseum was never built. The Third Reich did not become the curator of Western civilization. But fragments of that ambition persist in every restitution dispute. Because each case forces societies to answer uncomfortable questions about complicity, delay, and silence. How many institutions knew? How many chose not to ask? How many preferred stability over confrontation? Silence can be inherited, just like art. In the end, perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: art outlives ideology. The paintings survived the regime that stole them. They survived bombings, concealment, and attempted destruction. They will likely survive future conflicts too. But survival alone is not victory. Because art carries memory. And memory demands interpretation. Whoever frames the painting frames the story. And whoever frames the story shapes the future. The Nazis believed that by collecting the masterpieces of Europe, they could anchor their regime in permanence. They were wrong. Power built on theft collapses. But the questions they raised endure. Who defines cultural inheritance? Who decides which history is visible? Who speaks for the silenced? These questions are not confined to the 1940s. They echo every time a claim is filed, every time a museum label is rewritten, every time provenance is traced. The Third Reich sought to steal civilization. It failed. But the battle over stolen beauty continues, not in tunnels or mines, but in courtrooms, archives, and galleries. Because art is never just pigment on canvas. It is memory made visible. And memory, once displaced, never returns unchanged. The Nazis lost the war. They lost the museums they dreamed of. They lost the empire they tried to build. But the struggle over who owns beauty and who owns history is still unfolding. And every frame on a museum wall may carry more than a masterpiece. It may carry a question, unanswered.